We're looking today at Veena Das's Ordinary Ethics, Take 1. This is the first chapter in her book, Textures of the Ordinary, in which she broaches the topic of ethics. It's not the first time she's written about it, but it's the first time in this book that she's broaching the topic. And so we can think of this as sort of laying out the territory that she will investigate in later chapters in the book. She opens this chapter by drawing our attention to how problems arise in ordinary life, given the inherent vulnerability of our action and expression, and the way that skepticism shadows everyday life. So that is to say that it's not that action and expression are strictly separate, but it's helpful to think of them as in some ways distinguishable, so that we can think of any kind of action. Walking is vulnerable to errors. We trip, we stumble, we fall, we bump into things, and the same is true with expression as well. I'm sure that at some point, as I'm talking through this chapter, I'm going to make a slip of the tongue or choose the wrong word or something like that, so that even in something as familiar to me as language, I will stumble. I'm open to these kinds of vulnerabilities. Okay, so now what does Das have in mind? It is that the fact that in our everyday lives, we're prone to these kinds of slips and failures, that we cannot always, for example, keep our promises. We can't be sure, having broken a promise, that the excuse we provide will be accepted. We can't be sure that forgiveness will be forthcoming from the one to whom we give our excuses for having failed to keep our promises. All these sorts of things leave our lives with others fraught in ethically relevant ways, right? So that you can imagine you make a promise, something unexpected enters your life, some sort of contingency you hadn't budgeted for, and it derails your efforts to keep your promise, so that in spite of your best intentions, all the same, you don't manage to keep the promise you had made. Well, there's an ethical dimension to that. And so, because it bears on your relationship to another, and therefore, when you offer your excuse, there's an ethical environment, an ethical ambiance, you might say, in which the other has the option to accept and therefore forgive, or to withhold forgiveness and not accept. These are ethically relevant situations. So this is her starting point for thinking of ethics as ordinary. So not as a distinct, rarefied realm of human existence, but just as ordinary. Why? Because they're tied directly to these everyday vulnerabilities. She takes a point from Michael Lambach that because we are social and socialized and live our lives in language, we are unavoidably subject to and concerned with ethics, our own ethics and others' ethics. It's not that language is everything, it's that language is integral to our socialization, to our sociality, that we can't really think of human sociality as a whole without thinking of the place of language within it. And therefore, we're unavoidably concerned with ethics because we're unavoidably connected in this way that is prone to slips and failures, to say nothing of lies and dissimulation and so forth. Our life and language, then, is our source of connection to one another and a source of our vulnerability for the same reason. And in this way, it infuses our lives with ethical concern, because wherever we might find our connection in language, we might also find issues of ethical importance. Das, therefore, directs our attention to how we might think of, to quote her, the ethical as a dimension of everyday life, or even better, a spirit that infuses everyday life, in which we are not aspiring to escape the ordinary, but rather seeking to descend into it as a way of becoming moral subjects. So, as she points out at several points, contrary to much of the heritage of moral philosophy, the everyday is not what we need to extricate ourselves from in order to discover how to be moral or ethical beings, but rather we need to, as she says, descend into it. To consider moral striving being a topic that she's going to return to in future chapters as well. So to consider it from the everyday perspective she wants to describe, she has three main issues that run through this chapter and through later chapters as well. So I'm quoting from her now. How rule following is different from the notion of a moral life in the everyday. What it takes to allow life to be renewed, to achieve the everyday under conditions of grinding poverty or catastrophic violence that erode the very possibility of the everyday, and what form moral strivings take in the work performed to give birth to the eventual everyday from within the actual everyday. Actual and eventual everyday are connected terms, and a very simple way of putting it is that any eventual everyday is going to grow out of the actual everyday. But because our actual everyday lives are shot through with contingencies, with things that can interrupt our best laid plans, the eventual everyday that will arise out of it is also not determined in advance. There's a kind of openness there. In this section, the section Moral Life, Rules, Customs, and Habits, Das considers two ways of thinking of ethics. One concerns how one ought to live one's life, or how to live one's life well, with or for others. The other concerns self-fashioning or self-cultivation, what the philosopher, historian Michel Foucault called technologies of the self. Foucault. Unnecessary plug for another bald guy with glasses. Das is careful to note, however, that these ways of thinking of ethics are not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. Working on oneself involves the effort to bring oneself into accord with a moral tradition that lies outside oneself, which is to say we don't simply, each of us, invent a moral tradition exclusive to ourselves. That's not, very much like language, that's not how it works. Just as we inherit language from those who come before us and those around us, so too the moral tradition lies outside of ourselves. It's not simply a subjective creation. Das wants to reflect on practices of ethical self-fashioning oriented as they are to ethical concepts we find outside ourselves, in the light of her earlier discussion of how such work occurs in the context of the recognition of the vulnerability and fragility of everyday life, especially in conditions of poverty or migration that can amplify vulnerability and fragility. Turning to her own fieldwork in low-income Delhi neighborhoods, she points to the ways that the smallest of gestures can have ethical weight as expressions of care. So it's, again, not the case that care is the only way of expressing anything ethically relevant, but it is a way. Similarly, carelessness can have ethical implications for how or whether you will carry on with particular other people. So, waiting to sweep the floor after a guest has left, so as not to indicate that that individual is somehow equated with dirt, or keeping track of who takes their tea in which way, or neighborhood women setting aside their squabbles when the men in their lives come home from a day of work. These are the sorts of almost undetectable everyday ethical practices that Das notes. She says, the possibility of speaking of ordinary ethics allows us to think of the unethical as growing within the forms of life that people inhabit. It is, thus, not a matter of eliciting opinions about what behavior is considered ethical and what unethical, or of cataloging cultural practices on which we can bring judgment from an objective, distant position, but rather of seeing how forms of life grow particular dispositions. So then, part of what she's pointing to here with this contrasting of forms of life growing particular dispositions as distinct from simply collecting opinions is the notion that even to have an ethical or a moral opinion about something relies already on having a different kind of agreement, an agreement in form of life, as this basis on within which we share criteria about what an ethical or a moral action could be, what can count as an ethical or moral action, which in itself also has, as I was saying earlier, a kind of openness to it, a certain indeterminacy, in much the way that we have to work out how we can project words into unfamiliar circumstances, whether those words will be taken up as meaningful in that projection or not. This is kind of an analog to how different kinds of ethical projects or actions may count as ethical or not. She turns to the way that people in her fieldwork narrated events, especially painful ones, to draw our attention to how language here is not simply a mode of communication, but one of expression. So I noted earlier the pairing of action and expression. So here we have a return to the notion of expression. This is a Wittgensteinian idea, right? The idea that language is about expression. Sure, we can communicate about it, but that's not all that we do with it. We don't just communicate, we express ourselves as well. In particular, she says, one that expresses ethical commitments that have become completely embedded in everyday life. That is, the expressive, everyday words and gestures sewn into narratives are knit into ways of acknowledging and withholding acknowledgement of specific other people. Das takes up examples of saving face, protecting another's face, or risking face, one's own or others, to point to the way that small, ordinary gestures and word choices may contain slights that may cover potential loss of face. I'll take a brief tangent here before coming back to her point to say that something like this arose in the course of my own field work in Thailand. So at one point, I was sort of bunking at someone's house, and they had asked nothing of me, but at a certain point, they said, so would you mind helping one of the girls, a 12-year-old girl who lived also in the household, with her English? And so that was fine. I was happy to do that. And so one of the things that we worked on is in mastering the TH sound in English. It's very forbidding for Thai people. It doesn't exist on its own in Thai. And so just as things like starting a word with an NG sound is not, it's not part of English. And so it's something that you have to learn if you're going to say particular words. A word like ngon that does not roll off the English tongue without practice, so the TH sound also doesn't do it. So we spent some time at it. She got the hang of it. It was great. She went to school the next day. When she came home, I asked her if her teacher had been pleased that she was now able to pronounce these sounds, and she said, "Oh no, I didn't do that." And when I asked why, she explained how it would, because her teacher couldn't do that herself, if she had started to do something in her English class that her English teacher couldn't do, it would have compromised her. It would have been a loss of face for her. So that this girl took it upon herself to protect her teacher's face, and therefore her standing in the classroom by not demonstrating a skill in English that her teacher herself lacked. So then this is a gesture that, from the teacher's point of view, is completely undetectable because it's about what she didn't do. And yet, this, I would say, falls within this kind of category of taking care for another that has a kind of ethical dimension to it. Okay, so now back to Das. On occasions when people exchange words that could carry implicit insult or entering into gift exchange, there's an agreement among actors that maintains what may be a delicate balance between enhancing one's own honor and prestige, as a gift giver, for example, and ensuring that others' honor and prestige remains undisturbed, perhaps as receiving a gift, or in the word choices that you use when welcoming someone into your home to make sure that when they come in, they are not feeling that they are the recipients of some kind of charity for you having invited them in. Again, though, this is an agreement of a particular sort. This is not agreement in opinions. It's not a contractual agreement. She writes, "This delicacy of communication is preserved not only in publicly performed actions of greetings and gift exchanges, but also in the minutest shifts in words and tones. The agreements that I speak of here, however, are neither contractual agreements nor agreements in opinions. They grow out of forms of life." Again, then, this notion of agreement in form of life as just the foundation on which something like an exchange of opinions could take place, so that an agreement in opinions is not even something you can entertain without already agreeing in forms of life. All right, what is she talking about with form of life and the agreement that is so central to the sharing of a form of life? She's drawing these concepts from philosophers Ludwig Wittgenstein and Stanley Cavell. In Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein responds to an imaginary partner in conversation. Much of his writing in the Investigations is done this way, as an imagined dialogue. So, starting with his conversational partner, you're saying that human agreement decides what is true and false? It is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language that they use. That is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. He distinguishes agreement in language. In the next section in the book, 242, he'll say that this is agreement in judgments, from agreement in opinions, so that we can see that in order for us to exchange opinions, we must already have this underlying agreement. An agreement that I characterized a moment ago as agreement in criteria, so that when he says we agree in the language that we use, there's this notion that a shared language is the basis on which we can then share opinions. They're not mutually exclusive things, though, but rather mutually implicated in one another. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So, Cavell first. From Cavell, Das draws a further elaboration on Wittgenstein's notion of form of life. Most readers emphasize form, as in form of life, but Cavell and Das take Wittgenstein also to place emphasis on life, therefore form of life. Okay, now this passage. These two things are not mutually exclusive. We can think of them as mutually implicated in one another, as intersecting one another from top to bottom. So on the first axis, we could think of things, that is, form of life, like rituals, customs, traditions, other social practices of that sort. So, perhaps a marriage. The form does not need to be the same from place to place. The idea simply is that there is a form, a certain kind of ritual, a certain kind of custom, what have you. On the other axis, we could think of what counts as a human form of life, which is a question of criteria, what counts as a human form of life, but also a question of limits. What is the limit of the human form of life? Given the criteria we call on to tell what counts as a human form of life, we could also ask about what humans can do and what the limits are to what humans can do, which is a question that arises in Dass's fieldwork when people witnessed or experienced violence that seemed inhuman, in that it threw the perpetrator's humanness into question. So we can think that we share a form of life, not just to the extent that we share rights, customs, traditions, and so forth, but also to the extent that we find agreement in criteria. For example, criteria about what the human life form is. Now, that brief detour complete hopefully gives you enough that you can have a sense of what's at stake for Dass when she writes of forms of life growing certain dispositions or certain agreements that are not agreements on the model of contracts or opinions, but are the sort that contracts or opinions require in the first place. So we can think by way of a simple, almost trivial example, that we don't enter into contracts with a pet dog or a pet cat. For one thing, we know that a pet cat is never going to keep a contract with a human. But, joking aside, why? It's because the life form, the form of life, is not a human form of life. And a human form of life is the necessity that we have for entering into things like contracts or marriage and so on. So we might also appreciate how something going awry at this level of agreement in form of life, or what I call agreements and criteria, may have far more devastating consequences than simply opposing opinions or failure to live up to one's contracts. They might be just the kind of thing to throw our familiarity or contact with everyday life into disarray or into peril. Thus, the blurring of distinctions between gifts, charity, and debt, for example, with a careless word or when inviting wedding attendees to eat, one of the examples that she gives, might imperil one's relationship with another. This subtle power of language to insult, to throw doubt into your future together. One might think here of the work that Iago does to Othello to cast his relationship to Desdemona into doubt, if you're interested in that sort of example, is also, however, the power to cover over circumstances in which another might easily lose face. That is, to protect another from losing face, like the example that I gave from my own experience. So that example, as I said, is distinct but not unilluminating for what Dass talks about. In the circumstances Dass explores, distinctions between gifts, charity, and debt are fraught distinctions and must be signaled without being explicitly put into words, because putting them explicitly would bring them to light and would therefore create an ethically salient situation, one where things could become contentious, where it's unnecessary, where it doesn't have to happen. Such indirect statements cannot be formulated as rules, as much moral philosophy would define morality or ethics. She says, instead, thus, they are distinguished from rules, but offer opportunities to express bits of moral wisdom that can be deployed in particular circumstances to a variety of actions, admonish, console, or help to cover up an embarrassing situation. So that we can already see here that in that passage, there's a certain scope to ethical action and ethical expression. As I said, it's not just all about care, even though care is a particularly visible way of engaging in ethical action. Given the examples of ethics arising in and from everyday life, Das raises the prospect of habit as a part of ethical life. She says, "Are the sorts of descriptions of everyday life I offer not too quotidian to qualify as forms of ethical behavior? I offer some reflections on the imagination of human action and on the moral as a dimension of everyday life rather than as a separate domain to defend my metaphor of a descent into the ordinary. I attempt to do so by recasting habit as a kind of moral action and by showing how dramatic enactments of ethical value, as in publicly performed rituals or in legal pronouncements on rules, are grounded within the normative practices of everyday life." She contrasts her position with that of philosophers and, of course, some anthropologists of morality who consider ethical commitments in terms of departures from everyday life. I mentioned this earlier. So I won't rehearse the arguments here. She goes through them in the chapter, but just give Das's explanation of the difference she sees in her way of thinking. The kind of philosophical formation that Hadot being the philosophical figure who she discusses, is thinking is about scaling heights, right? Scaling moral heights to escape from the sort of everyday muck where morality is unclear, uncertain. Whereas I am trying to wrest the very expression of spiritual exercises away from the profundity of philosophy to the small disciplines that ordinary people perform in their everyday lives to hold life as the natural expression of ethics. Hence also as the natural site of unethical behavior. Devoting attention to the small acts that allow life to be knitted together pair by pair, a passage she takes from Cavell, helps us see how habit and custom fall into the set of actions and practices we might consider as ethical. But it also requires freeing our analysis from the assumption that only instances of individual agency and intentionality might be ethical. We can start to see here the importance of her emphasis on habit then, if we take it for granted that habits are forms of action that we've developed in a way that don't require our intentionality, that don't require our conscious consideration in order to undertake them. Here, Das resists the idea that it is only by formulating morality as rules, which we intentionally follow or flout as individual agents, that we get a grasp on ethics in life. Calling on Wittgenstein, she proposes that it is only in seeing how rules entangle with the habits and customs of everyday life that we see how a way of following them seems right. She points to the habitual way that a woman she knows, that this is a woman whose home she would frequent in her fieldwork often, would prepare tea tailored to various individual preferences as instances of care, hence ethical, not despite the fact that these are expressions of care, that these are habitual, right? She's learned that Das doesn't take sugar in her tea, that another likes clotted cream, that another likes a little bit of milk. These are all expressions of care. She's internalized them as matters of habit, but that fact that they're habitual, that she doesn't need to go through the sort of conscious, intentional work each time she does this of figuring out who needs what, these are nonetheless ethical. They're ethical as habitual, as the result of prolonged attentiveness to and concern for others. Das's way of looking at the possibility of ethical behavior in habit is to detect the human in otherwise automatic actions. So this partly bears on earlier fieldwork that she's done, earlier writing that she's done on fieldwork in situations of violence where the survivors of that violence are that they narrate their stories with expressions like, was it a man or a machine who plunged the knife into another, right? And so that again has that idea of a limit of the human built into it. So can automata undertake human actions? Well, so she's trying to detect this difference. What is it that puts the humanness in otherwise automatic actions, like habits? She takes pretending as a paradigm example that brings us to the limit of the mechanical, in particular with respect to concealment, like concealment of intentions. Whoops. Sorry about that. She says, with respect to concealment, pretending, here we find the ethical within the habitual or routine where we least expect it to be, namely in acts of concealment and pretending through which one's knowledge of the constrained circumstances of the other is hidden when offering a larger than usual gift, or in the use of words to recast a debt as gift. Gift exchange commonly involves the receiving and fulfilling of obligations. But Das, like in the work of Clara Hahn, in The Difficulty of Kindness, is pointing to a different possibility for such routine actions. Similarly, the concealment in pretending is often intended to deceive others. And you see that in the work of J.L. Austin, on whom both Clara Hahn and Veena Das draw to think about pretending, the examples he gives are usually issues of malevolent deception. Not always the case, as we can see in an example like Clara Hahn's essay, The Difficulty of Kindness. But also here, Das wants also to draw our attention to the way that deception or pretending, concealment, may be a way to shield another from my knowledge that, should I express it, may be devastating. So that if I am aware of something that could bring shame to the other person, my concealing the knowledge of what that person is enduring through may be a way of protecting that individual from shame, possibly a devastating shame. With this in mind, she claims that habits do much more than act as the flywheels of society. They remind us that in the face of the precariousness of life, the mundane rituals we evolve, the way we conceal knowledge that might hurt, the way we continue to secure routine, is what allows our lives with others to be regarded as ethical or unethical. The companion to this, of course, is that the accumulation of everyday habits or hurtful inattention, either one, can undermine, everyday barbs, not everyday habits. The accumulation of everyday barbs or hurtful inattention can undermine the possibility of life together in ordinary ways. Right? It doesn't require some what Veena Das in another moment calls a critical event, some cataclysmic event throwing everyday life into chaos. It doesn't require that. Everyday barbs, inattention, that these are perfectly ordinary things, but that they can have all the same catastrophic implications within a relationship. So what about good and evil? First, she says, it is important not to lose sight of the ways that judicial reason is employed in actual cases, for example, of torture. Whoops, I got them out of order again. Okay, so Das is responding to a potential criticism here. That is, the criticism of her emphasis of the ordinary with respect to ethics. So, first, that we should not lose sight of the ways that judicial reason is employed in actual cases, as in torture. In this way, atrocious acts in fact do have ordinary dimensions, but Das also proposes shifting our focus away from the dramatic event of torture, say, and the attribution of blame, which is not always easy to assess, and toward the work of time. Such refocusing allows us the opportunity to see how people live dramatic events in their everyday lives, the reverberation sometimes remaining in the background for many years and possibly reasserting themselves in unexpected ways or at unexpected moments. She recounts Talebi's account of imprisonment in an Iranian prison and the regular use of torture there. What emerges is a complicated picture of prisoners who succumb to torture and turn into informants. And from a distance, it would be easy to condemn those people for becoming informants. Informants on the other women in the cell block with them. In one case, while the informant's family saw fit to condemn her, we find that Talebi, who shared a cell block with this woman, Fawzi, Talebi herself, having experienced the regime of torture that eventually broke Fawzi, doesn't find such judgment so easy to make. She's not, in other words, ready to condemn Fawzi the way that Fawzi's family, who is not experiencing this torture, does. Something that startles Talebi is the discovery that, having eventually been freed and moving to the US, she can recover everyday life, fall in love, and that ordinary life can still wound in ordinary ways, like heartbreak. So this would be a way then that, to just make sure that the point is clear, that on the one hand, the atrocity of something like, or the atrocious behavior of becoming an informant against the other women in the prison is something that other women who have experienced the same kinds of torture but have not yet succumbed don't necessarily feel feel inclined to condemn, that they have a certain understanding of it that makes condemnation difficult, even while those who are distanced from it and who are not experiencing it may be quick to condemn. That's one part. The other part then is that Talebi, having experienced torture as an event or as a series of events that is in some way contained within a specific period of time, is surprised later in life to discover that she can do something like fall in love. Why? Because torture and imprisonment has had this kind of enduring presence in her life that has made some things seem impossible or beyond the imagination. And then she's also startled to discover that she can experience heartbreak when that love dissolves. So that even though the imprisonment and torture might have specific dates attached, the way that they make their way into her ordinary life is not contained in the same way, and that it can bear within it this kind of unexpectedness. Okay, so then what is Das getting at with this harnessing of atrocity to the everyday. She says, I suggest that moral philosophy here is taken on paths to which it is not accustomed. Let me go further and state that just as in the ordinary course of life, we might find the presence of moral and ethical formulations within everyday habitual acts, so in the cases of the kinds of violence described by the testimonial literature, the ethical may be found in the impersonal rhythms of the social that allow life to be knitted together again. It's important to note here then that Das does not depict the ordinary as a refuge from suffering or violence. As I said earlier, we can also include doubt, skepticism, uncertainty. It's not a refuge from those things, but it is the only site on which one or a community might rebuild everyday life after devastation. Also important to recognize is that destruction, say by violence, need not be exclusively physical, so that the scene of devastation, when she talks about the scene of devastation, again, she's citing Wittgenstein and Cavell, talking about the way that philosophy can seem to lay waste to everything that's secure, and then saying we have no other grounds but the ordinary to rebuild a sense of life. So that the scene of devastation then is one in which it is life together that has been damaged. So that when Das talks of re-inhabiting the space or the scene of devastation again, we have to keep in mind that this implies all of the fraught, tenuous work of creating a future together out of the tatters of a ravaged life. So not just the ravaged, say, cityscape or landscape that is left behind from violence, but the tattered relations that need to be knit back into one another. Calling on the work of Wittgenstein scholar Cora Diamond, Das endorses an idea of the moral as a responsiveness to life. What matters, she says, is not one dramatic moment of decision, but the attention to detail that thinking of life entails. For me, it is not that one becomes a monster or a saint in one dramatic moment, but rather that how one engages with one's ordinariness within the everyday scenes of good and bad defines who one is or who one becomes. In such a view, while ethics in general or in the abstract may remain elusive, ethics in the particular is what human beings can strive for, though never fully succeed in. Here we come to the end of the paper. Thank you for listening.